Good evening, and thank you for being here on another episode of Untold for some special interviews about the history of Black Arlington. Tonight, I have two authors with me from new books that were recently published in late 2020 that are all about their lives and their families and their experiences in Arlington, much of it during the time when Arlington was strictly segregated. So tonight, I'm happy to have join me tonight, Dr. Alfred O. Taylor and Lydia Jones Cole. Thank you both for being with us. And if you would, give us a couple of moments of introduction in terms of you introducing why you wrote your book and about your connection to Arlington. Dr. Taylor, would you go first, please?
Sure, thank you, Ms. Jones, for having me to this evening. I wrote my second book after many occasions of telling stories on other people. I kept being reminded of, you know everyone else's story. Who's gonna write your story when you're gone? And with that, I decided that I would start writing some things about my life story, which I must say was an amazing story. So I titled my book, What an Amazing Journey. And I based my book off of a flight of geese or ducks. And if you ever seen a flight of geese, you'll see they fly in a V shape with the lead goose in the front and doubling up all the way back. The reason for that is the lead goose is the one who's fighting most of the turbulence, and the rest of them are drafting off the goose. So I decided to model my life story after that, starting with childhood with my father as the lead goose, up into my marriage, wherein the goose takes on a mate for life. And that's when I took on my mate for 67 years. And all the way to the end, when a goose gets sick or drops out of the flight, two people drop out of the formation and stay with the goose until they pass or join another flight. So that was the basis of my book. So it was really inspired by many people telling me that in my first book, I wrote about other people's lives. And most of my Black history presentation, I was talking about other people, and I was inspired by or kept being cajoled who was going to write about my life. So I decided to do snippets of my life, not just for public, but for the main reason of that family would have a history over the years.
That's a great reason to start. And often it grows into more, which I found out as well. So Lydia, can you tell us about your story and how you came to write your book, You Must Be a Jones?
Well, my story is also your story, since you're my sister. And I was inspired to write our story, our family story, for a number of reasons. And it kind of goes back to meeting people from all different facets of life growing up initially. And as I met people throughout my life, I realized that our lives were special, and that we had a really just a special environment, special family. And the more I met other people, the more I realized that. But the other thing is, I knew that there were, it wasn't just our family, it was our neighborhood, it was our community, it was Green Valley, it was Halls Hill, and other places around the country that were historically African-American neighborhoods that had a very special flavor and energy and spirit about them. And I didn't hear or see other people talking about that. And I wanted to make sure that what the media talked about and what seemed to be sort of the preeminent feeling about African-American families did not become a standing or something the way people accepted. So I thought writing our story and telling our story would be a way to begin to level the playing field and to make sure that people saw that we had, despite challenges, particularly growing up during segregation and growing up in a big family, that we had some very special things and very special gifts that money could not buy, that we were afforded by virtue of our family, by virtue of Black values, by virtue of our being in a community where people believed in fighting for what they deserve.
That's a good point, and that takes me to another area I'd like to explore with you all in terms of what are those important perspectives of life in Black Arlington that you wanted to bring up. And I'm going to give you kind of a little bit of background. The reason that I asked that is because when I started working on my book, one of the things that kind of gave me an impetus was the whole story of the help and how a white woman came back and wrote that particular story. And I was like, I want a Black person to tell our Black stories. So was that something that both of you, either of you shared? Lydia, why don't you go first this time?
Well, I guess in some ways, sort of tangentially, that was part of it, because, you know, in the media, in the echo chamber, there were other people telling our stories. There were other movies and things here and there that came out that gave a more well-rounded and a more true perspective of African-American life. But there were just so few of them. And generally people that were not Black or that are not Black latched on to what was negative and made it as if we were, you know, our entire race was all the same and that we all had the same experiences. So certainly in the mainstream media and how the stories were being told was a big part for me, particularly having worked in the media my whole career. So that was a big part of getting, sharing our story and my voice to, again, to try to level the playing field, to give a more real perspective of what Black family life was like.
And how about you, Dr. Taylor? I know that you've had a different voice and have spoken out in so many different areas. Why did the book piece and what perspectives did you want to make sure that you shared?
Well, I would like to go back to my first book of Bridge Builders. Once I retired from the university, I started to substitute teach at Drew School. I went in there because I was president of the Civic Association, and there were some problems in the school. And I thought that the best way I could get in was to go in as a substitute teacher, to be trying to find the inside of really what the problem was. But what I found when I went in there, I fell in love with the students. And I confess now, if I had to do my career over again, I would be an elementary school teacher. But I went in and I was there for Black History Month, which we're in now. And it seems that every Black History Month, the students got the same assignment. Write an essay by Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, you know, the national figures. And it occurred to me that, wow, we have people in our own community who have made local and national contributions that the students never discuss, never know anything about, and some of them are their own relatives. And they are lacking in this because people do not pass down stories anymore. So I decided from there to form a resource group to get space in Drew School, to get set up artifacts and a place where we can house these stories and things for Black history so that the teachers could give them assignments on local people. Well, I assembled a group, and one of the people in the group was the grants director from Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And in telling my story, he said, Taylor, you have so many stories in your head. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And I told him, I hadn't. He said, if you could get me a draft manuscript together in 3 months, I think I could get you a grant for some of your stories. So I did pull together my draft manuscript.
Lydia, talk a little bit to me about your research, because I know that you did a bunch of research and you're kind of the genealogist in our family. So can you talk a little bit about your research and kind of what you did to bring all of those pieces together?
Well, I have to give you and your book lots of credit, because a tremendous amount of my research was done for me with regard to the greater community and weaving those stories into our own family story. So your Halls Hill story that you wrote was a big part, but I started researching our family, oh, geez, I guess maybe 15, 20 years ago, just a little by little. And growing up, I guess, is when I kind of gathered that fascination. Mom used to always say to me, "You're looking at those pictures again?" And I used to constantly pull the family albums out and look at the pictures and ask her questions about this person or that person. And I just was always fascinated about who our family was, who was Nana, our grandmother's, who her mother, what her mother looked like, and all of those things. So that was really sort of where the interest first started. And then when Ancestry.com came around, I started searching on Ancestry, and actually became almost, particularly when I was living in Texas, it became almost kind of obsessive. I had to make myself go to sleep at night because I would find a new piece of information about our family or something, about our neighborhood. And I started reading subscribing to the newspaper.com and reading stories in there. At that time, as you know, Wilma, you've done your research, every little thing that happened in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, every little fist fight, it was in the paper, so they mentioned the names and what happened and the fires. So all of those things, I weaved together, and I was able to really learn and actually help educate even mom and dad about things that they didn't know about their grandparents, or things that were just, weren't passed down, or, they were just everyday life. So people didn't necessarily talk about them. So that's where my research started. And I'm still doing it. I'm still doing that research, but that really informed, and it just excited me. It energized me. And even, writing the book did the same thing. And I really had to stop myself from researching the family while I was doing the book, so that I could keep writing and making my deadlines. But that's really where my impetus and interest first began. And then the things about sort of life stories and things that you think about and you learn as you go out in the world, that just made that interest even bigger.
Great, great. Now, Dr. Taylor, I read your book, and it was fascinating the amount of information you know about your ancestors. Can you share with us some of that information and how you found out about it?
Well, I found out, and you constantly finding out in preparing to write the book that I'm writing now. I knew very little about my mother's family, only knew that my great-grandfather was a Buffalo soldier. Then in researching through Ancestry.com and all I found further that all the way up to my third great-grandmother, was freed a slave in 1862 in Georgetown, D.C. That was a year before the emancipation. They freed the slaves in D.C. first. So I found out that my third great-grandmother and my second great-grandmother, her daughter, were both freed as slaves in the only house that's still remaining on the Georgetown waterfront lived in. The oldest house, not the only, the oldest, that's called the Brickyard Hill House, that they were freed by the owner of that house, Peter
Wow.
Von Essence, in May 13, 1862. At the time, slaves were considered products, so they had to put a price on the slave's head. My third great-grandmother was born in 1800, so she was 62 years of age. They put a price on her head of $150. Her daughter, Martha, was 30 years of age. They put a price on her head of $800 plus her brother, Charles. And they put lesser prices on their kids. And that brought me, and I found that out because my great-grandmother, who was Matilda Hawkins, that was their mother and her grandmother. So in researching for this book, I ran across another whole area that added to this book of my great-grandfather, who ran away in 1865 to join the Buffalo Soldiers. In doing the research on the Buffalo Soldiers, there was not a whole lot of information on the Black troopers. Most of the information was on the white officers. So I had to trace the white officers to find out the battles that my great-grandfather fought in. And as I said, he fought in the last battle, was the Battle of Wounded Knee. And he was a member of the 9th Cavalry, Company K, who rode for 24 hours from Nebraska to Pine Ridge to try to save the cavalry, 7th Cavalry, which was all white at Pine Ridge Reservation. As a result of the great cavalry ride, their commanding officer, Major Guy Howard, petitioned Congress to bring them to Fort Myer, Virginia. And they were the first African-American troop to be stationed east of the Mississippi at Fort Myer. They were brought to Fort Myer in 1891. And my great-grandfather retired in 1893. If you know Fort Myer, if you go down Route 50, the gate on Fort Myer is called the Howard Gate. And that was the commanding officer who brought my grandfather now to Fort Myer. And when he retired at Fort Myer, then he bought a home in Foggy Bottom of Washington, D.C. And that starts my mother's side of the family.
Wow, that is so interesting. Now, it's your father's side of the family who had the land in Green Valley that you still live adjacent to. Is that correct?
Yeah, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, bought his land in 1913 from John D. North. That's who the facility was, community
Right,
was
no.
named after, was the North community. He bought his in 1913. But my father and mother were born in Foggy Bottom. My father was born in 342nd, 22nd Street, that's now the site of the State Department. My mother was born at 2608 I Street, which is now the roadway into the Kennedy Center. Then both of their families bought into Arlington in the early 1900s when land started to open up and Georgetown became a little more crowded.
So that's how your family got to Arlington. So Lydia, you want to tell the story about how our family got to Arlington on mom and dad's side?
Well, you know, I talk about this only a little bit in the book in terms of setting the stage. The primary portions of the book talk about our immediate family, but obviously it was important to talk about how we got there and where our parents were from and about their family. And so our grandmother, our father's mother, Grandma Jones was, her mother was a slave. And I learned this from you, from the book, and which I think you learned from our cousin Margie. And
Elizabeth King.
Yes, she was a slave in Southern Virginia. Was it Norfolk or
Norfolk?
Norfolk. And when she got her freedom, she traveled to Arlington, not to Halls Hill, but to Arlington. And she ended up settling there, getting married, and having our grandmother and her siblings. Our Nana, Mama's mother, moved to DC first. She grew up in,
Branchville?
No, Branchville is where.
Oh, that's her husband. I'm sorry.
That's her husband, yeah. Branchville is where our great grandfather was, his family was. They had a farm there. But Nana grew up in Warrington, and she grew up there. Her mother's family was there, and she grew up with her grandparents because Nana's mother was working outside the house and to make money. And so, as many people did at that time, their grandparents raised them. But when she was older, she moved to DC, and I believe she lived with possibly Ida at the time, who was her age. They grew up together, but she was really her aunt, but they were like sisters. She got married to our grandfather, and they had Aunt Helen lived in DC for a little while, and then they moved to Arlington. Her mother was already in Arlington, which is probably what brought her there. Her mother had remarried, and moved to Arlington and was living, I think, in the Cherrydale area. And Nana and her husband, new husband and baby moved to Halls Hill. And that's how our family started, in Halls Hill, and continued to stay there and still there with, still some of us still living in Halls Hill. But they were there, they were part of the early group of, particularly our great grandmother Elizabeth. They were part of the early families that started in Halls Hill and built a life and a family there, and helped develop a thriving neighborhood that, from the very beginning, from your research and the research that I've read as well, really stuck together, depended on each other, and really everyone's survival was contingent upon everyone looking out for each other.
Good point. And you talked about building institutions and the like. Let's talk a little bit about those institutions. Dr. Taylor, can you talk? I know you started off going to school in Arlington and then ended up going, just like many of your generation, going to school in DC. But not only were the schools part of those important institutions, but especially the churches. And I know Green Valley had 3 strong churches. So can you talk a little bit about schools and churches and Black Arlington from that perspective in Green Valley, Dr. Taylor?
Sure, but I'd like to back up and just make one point. That you realize that Arlington did not come about until 1920. So
right.
Our families moved to Alexandria.
Right. It was Alexandria County. Yes, exactly.
So our family precede Arlington.
Yes, we did.
But as you said earlier, and I'm glad you mentioned churches, the Macedonia Baptist Church was started in my wife's grandparents' living room in 1908. That my wife's grandparents were Bonda and Amanda Johnson, who the Community Development Corporation in Green Valley is named. Although my wife's family kind of traveled the same path as my family. My wife's mother was born in real Georgetown on Prospect Street, that's up over by Georgetown University, and their families likewise moved to Arlington. But yes, I grew up in Arlington, and I only went to school to the 3rd grade. And then I was transferred to Washington, D.C. Public school system, which my parents also were products. Although they grew up in Arlington, they too went to the Washington, D.C. schools for their education. And one of the reasons then that during that time, I know during my era, that the Washington, D.C. school system was among the top public school systems in the country. People used to send their kids from all over the United States to attend Washington, D.C. public school. Why? One of the reasons, it was funded by Congress and not by the state, so they had more money coming to them. So you had more choices. It wasn't that we were downing the county schools, but you had more choices in the DC school of following your career aspirations. That I went to them talking about churches. You said 3. We considered Green Valley anchored by 4 churches.
Okay.
We had Mount Zion Baptist Church, which started in 1866 in Freedman's Village as part of the old Bell Church.
Right.
They relocated to East Arlington. The church there was taken up by eminent domain, and
Right.
they had to move. So they built the church in Green Valley in 1946. On the northeast, we have Our Lady Queen of Peace Catholic Church. Well, prior to 1944, the Catholics in Green Valley had to either go to DC to worship in a Catholic parish, or the one in Alexandria, the one Black in Alexandria, that was St. Joseph. In 1944, 15 families petitioned the Archdiocese to build a Catholic church in Arlington for African Americans. And that's when Our Lady Queen of Peace came on in 1947. On the southeast, we have Lomax AME Zion Church, which also originated in Freedman Village as part of Little Zion Methodist Church. And they relocated in the Green Valley like in 1878 or something, and they relocated from Freedman Village. They rebuilt in the valley. Then on the southwest, we had Macedonia, which was the only one birthed in Green Valley at that time. That was birthed in 1908. So our churches were the center focus of our community. And all of the churches, Mount Salvation, Callaway, all of them, regardless of what your religious upbringing was, when the churches gave their activities for the community, not just for their people, they gave it for the community. The churches were the one who tried to assimilate the amenities that we couldn't go to or things. So they mirrored. So as kids, we didn't feel we were as deprived as we were because the churches kind of gave us those same things.
Absolutely. You mentioned the 2 churches that got their start on Halls Hill. Lydia, you want to talk a little bit about the Mount Salvation in Callaway? And I mean, just what Dr. Taylor said in terms of the churches filling in the gap in terms of amenities, especially for youth.
Absolutely. I mean, the churches were a just a big part of just not the community, but our lives. You know, when school ended on Friday, you know, we transitioned to church on Saturday and Sunday. Saturday, you were rehearsing for the choir or program, or on Sunday, you were in Sunday school, you were in regular 11 o'clock service, and you were in afternoon or evening service. And particularly when we were young and even older, it was just where you came together with other families and your friends. It was a place of community in terms of, you know, and action and activity. It was also where people were respected and had, you know, a sense of particularly as young people you had a different sense of respect. You knew that you were going to see everybody there. Everybody contributed in different ways, and in terms of what they brought and their skills, their talents, their intelligence, and that same community in church also was a same community that helped build and look out for us in terms of advocacy, making sure that we had what we needed and not relenting with the county. That was one of the things I look back on in just, in many ways, in amazement at just the intelligence, the tenacity, and the will to never give up, you know, to even when, you know, knowing that, you know, it was always going to be a fight, with a good spirit. And, you know, our parents and their parents in the church, and then in the Citizens Association, they were all kind of blended together. It really was little separation between the two, because in a small community, the same people were there. And then as young people, the church definitely, you know, opened doors to us outside the community. I think of when this one of the stories I tell in my book that's really makes me laugh when I think about it is the trip to the beach, the day that Linwood and my twin brother and I were born, because it was a big day, and George was 9 years old, and because mom went into labor, it looked like George wasn't going to get his trip to the beach. And, you know, for us and for lots of other people in the neighborhood, it wasn't for us at that very moment, because I wasn't there yet. But that trip to the beach was his vacation. It was a big deal. It was not a small thing. And mom and dad planned and worked, and the food you cooked, because you couldn't buy anything there. You had to take everything with you. So it was more than a trip to the beach. You know, it was really where everybody got to let down, where you got to enjoy life in a way that Black people had few opportunities to. So the church provided that opportunity. And then with Reverend Brown.
Hold on. You have to finish telling the story, Lydia.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, the story is, the day is 1951, July 28th.
Oh, and that's one other thing. You all were born on the same day.
It's your birthday, July 28th.
Oh, is that your birthday?
Yes,
oh
I meant to say that because I read that in his book, and I was like, Dr. Till and Lydia and Linwood had the same birthday.
Oh, that is too funny. Oh, that's incredible. Well, on your birthday
in 1951,
my mother went into labor after spending all day the day before frying chicken, making potato salad, getting everything ready for her 3 kids at the time, Michael, George, and Roz. But Roz and Mike were kind of little. They were, you know, 3 and 4. You know, George was 9. This was a big deal for him. And when mom went into labor in the morning, it was like his world was broken. What do you mean we can't go to the beach? But he got to go to the beach because my dad is just was an amazing man. He made it all work, and he got mom to the hospital in DC.
Yeah.
With my grandmother, left her, came back, picked up George and Roz and Mike, then drove 3 hours to the beach, and spent the day, came back, took them to one of the grandparents to his mother to take care of, because mom's mother was at the hospital with her, and he went to pick up his new one baby. And when he got there were two. So it was just from the early morning to the early evening and on. It was one of the most memorable stories and days in our family's life. It all worked out, obviously, but it said a lot telling that story about just how important the church was and the activities and opportunities they made for our community by the trips to the beach, and then years later the camp at
Baptist Center.
Being able to go there and being able to provide just something for young Black kids that it wasn't automatic. You couldn't just go anywhere and have a sleepaway camp, like white kids could, even if it was just, putting up a teepee or whatever. You couldn't go anywhere. You were limited on what your opportunities. So people who committed, organizations like the church and later on for us, Langston and the recreation department that literally worked. We didn't know this as kids, but when they made sure, they sat down and thought about what we needed, what we were missing, and they made those opportunities happen for us so that our lives would be just as enriched with culture and activities and experiences as the white kids that were around us had and took for granted. And actually, we kind of took for granted growing up because we didn't know. We thought, oh, well, this is what we're supposed to have. I mean, George might look at it a little differently because some of those things came about after he was older, but particularly, once for me and for Wilma and, those were, it's like, well, that's what we do. Of course we have tap dance and we have ballet and, but looking back, I really realized just how precious and how special those things were. And they didn't just automatically happen. People had to do a lot of work to make those opportunities for us, to make sure that we had them through the church, through school, and the recreation, the Black section of the recreation.
Yes.
One of the big things in Macedonia was that if you had good attendance at Sunday school, you could go to the beach free. And that was Sparrows Beach. That was the highlight. And we used to take like 4 and 5 buses to the beach. That was the day the whole community. Yep. I mean, whether you were in the church, everybody in the community knew what Macedonia Sunday school was going to the beach.
Let's talk about churches from a different perspective, though, because you mentioned both of you mentioned citizens associations on the Hill, John M. Langston, and Johnson's Hill, of course, the Johnson's Hill and Green Valley, and the churches, and how did you handle any issues regarding racism or discrimination in your book, which these institutions basically helped the communities organize and, overcome many of the issues? Dr. Taylor, you want to go first?
One great story. Well, I was born July 28, 1934. In that July, Dr. Roland Bruner started his practice in Green Valley. Prior to that, as was mentioned earlier, because Arlington Hospital was not too receptive to Black patients, most of the women who went to hospital had to travel to Washington, D.C., to Freedman's Hospital to give birth. But when Dr. Bruner came into the community, he started assisting mothers on birthing at home. So I was one of his first patients, birthed under his patient in July. But the story on racism, Dr. Bruner was hired by the Arlington County government to teach Planned Parenthood to Black African-American women. But they refused to let him practice in the health department, which was in Cherrydale or Clarendon at the time. They set him up in an office in Arlington County Jail to teach Black parents parenthood. Later on, he went in, but he was the first African-American hired by Arlington County for their health department, but not allowed to practice in their health department.
We're almost at the end, but Lydia, I want you to talk a little bit about any kind of racism or discrimination story that you might want to bring up, and especially in terms of the impact and everything of, you know, growing up in this kind of segregated community.
You positioned it exactly right, because my book is about family, and so there's definitely lots of stories about racism, but they're from the perspective as, in many instances, as kids growing up. And that's not something that you often hear people talk about. They talk about segregation or integration and segregation and what from a history perspective, but I thought it was important to share what it felt like as a child growing up, what those slights, like going to, and Sandra Green tells this story in that campaign that you all ran about changing Lee Highway. And when I heard it, I thought to myself, it was just so powerful. And it's a story about going to Robertson's 5 and 10 cent store and how we used to go there every week with our quarter as little kids. I mean, we were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, you know, 5, and Dad would give us our quarter. He'd go to the Safeway, which is now NTB, and we'd run across the street. And every week, when we went in that store, innocent little kids running around trying to figure out, oh, what toy are we gonna get? A white woman that, well, I guess was one of the owners or worked there, literally would follow us and you know, and look at us negatively, frowning. You know, obviously, even as little kids, we could tell she didn't want us there, and she made an assumption that we were gonna do something bad, we were gonna steal. And we went through that every week. And I always thought it was amazing how our parents, in very subtle ways, helped us deal with that racism and not let it get into our psyche. You know, they taught us how to not accept or absorb that. It's really powerful. It's just thinking back on it as I was writing. And then the other thing is that we talk a lot and are very proud, we as a family and Arlington as a county, that we were the first place where the schools in Virginia were integrated. But we talk about it from the process and all the years of what happened. But what we don't often talk about is what we went through, Mike and Ronnie and Gloria and Lance initially, and then each of us that came after for many years, what it felt like to be in that bubble or to be just, a very small segment and know that people didn't want you there. You know, they didn't welcome you, you weren't included. And one of the ways that it kind of came out recently, like our 50-year reunion for Washington Lee happened, I guess 2 years ago. And I was talking to one of the people who was trying to get, he was emailing the Black people and saying, and he called me and he says, why don't the Black people want to come to the reunion? We can't ever get them to come to the reunion. And I said, well, frankly, we didn't have friends. You all didn't embrace us. We went to school there, but it wasn't somewhere where we felt that people wanted us, that we felt included. So, but now you want us to have some, you know, great memories about being there. And you didn't want us to be there. You treated us for the most part, unless you were an athlete. And I talk about that in my book. Yeah, I talk about walking down the hall and looking for a face to smile at and not seeing any. And then, but when you saw the football player and the basketball player, everybody was around them. And it was like, we didn't have value unless we were one of those jocks. We were of no significance. We weren't people they wanted to be friends with. We weren't people they wanted to, all of that was significant in terms of how it impacted our lives. But what was more significant was our families and our parents and our community, and how they just, not even by talking about it, just by not talking about it, by not making it a thing, we were able to just forget about that. We were able to not feel less than, not feel like we weren't worthy. And even before then, the teachers that we had at Langston really helped us with the foundation from an intellect standpoint, a knowledge standpoint, that, you know, they would not allow us to accept that, you know, we weren't going to be as good and as smart as the white kids. So that was also a big part of it. You know, they were like, you're just as smart, you can do just as well. And then when we got there, we saw we were, you know, we saw that what Mike talks about in a big way is that what made him and Ronnie and all of them successful in being the first to integrate was the foundation they got in the community, and the foundation and what they were taught at Langston Elementary. Because when they got there, they realized the work was not any harder, and the people weren't any smarter. And so the segregation and the racism, it was, in the book, I look at it as a child, you know, and point out the things about how it made us feel, and then how powerful our community was, how our village was, in terms of making us strong and having a real sense of self as Black people, and with confidence. Even before Black Power became a thing, we had that in our you know, psyche. We had that within ourselves, that we knew that we were worthy.
Exactly. That it gave us confidence. Exactly.
Exactly.
So thank you both. I want to get your closing thoughts. What do you want to tell the Untold audience about Black Arlington, and why they should learn more about Black Arlington from reading, Dr. Taylor, in your case, both of your books?
Yes, I feel that there's really a lot of untold stories about Arlington, and especially from the African American community. Although Arlington professes to be this great progressive county, it has not always been. It has not always been. It was not the physical violence or segregation that may occur in the Deep South, but it was there. And it was because of our churches, our teachers, who, as was said earlier, because our teachers, as well as our parents, they instilled in us, you are just as good as the white kid. And the teachers went a little farther. They said, you are as good as the white kid, and you're going to learn despite yourself. You're going to learn. And the reason I know you're going to learn, because I'm going to be here to teach you to learn.
All right, Lydia, can you close out our interview section with your thoughts, please?
So I think people need to learn more about our hidden history, and is through my book, learn about it from a very personal perspective, from a first person perspective, not just as history about how we experience those actions, how we experience those times and those moments. And I think most importantly, about the strength and the power of the Black family, just how strong we are, how smart we are, how adaptable and how, despite people literally continually trying to put us down, that we rise, we achieve, and that through our family, they'll see that story and realize that, as I talk about it, that it wasn't an anomaly. These things were happening throughout Black communities all over this country, and they continue to today. The more we talk about who we are, where we come from, and why our stories are important, the more we'll write that history, RIGHT.
Thank you both for being on. I appreciate it. This has been so interesting. In this episode's Did You Know segment, we're going to talk about Mrs. Lillian E Brown. She was an activist in the Arlington Black neighborhood for housing, education, and civil rights. Mrs. Brown was born in Atlantic City, but she grew up in Arlington. She was among the community leaders who started the Arlington Community Action Program in the 60s, where she began as a parent coordinator, and she was named director in 1974. She eventually retired as the director. She led efforts for community development, employment training, weatherization, energy conservation, services for ex-offenders, and more. She even spearheaded voter registration drives. She was very active at the Callaway United Methodist Church, where she served as chair of the administrative council for a number of years, as well as teaching Sunday school. The Langston Brown Community Center was renamed to include her name in her honor. We want to remember with love Lillian E Brown. Thanks again for joining us on another episode of Untold, Stories of Black Arlington. I hope you join us again soon.